So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Major General Jim Barry. He's been our patron for 14 years now. Yeah, too long. To open the conference.
Thank you, Andrew. It's, as always, my privilege and a pleasure as the patron, obviously, to officiate and welcome you to this particular conference. But as is my wont, our organisation, the Military History and Heritage Victoria, it was officially launched way back on the 4th of May 2011 by Professor Geoffrey Blaney, and the only bit I remembered was him saying he challenged us to make sure we were relevant. And I think we've managed to do that fairly well, particularly through conferences such as we're having today. Pardon me. Having made my normal statement for that, I'd also like to record this is the 19th such activity that we've had in now some 13 years. However, back to this conference, game of dominoes, Australian security and the Cold War. I think over the 2 days, and this is the 5th time we've had a 2-day conference, we believe that this conference covers an important and more often than most overlooked area of our military history, and I believe we've convened a balanced but well-diversified program for you with an excellent cast of presenters who will be acknowledged as we proceed through the 2 days. And as such, may I acknowledge and thank the conveners, Andrew Kilsby, who just gave you all the admin instructions, including the car park lottery, and also his co-convener, David Green, for pulling all this together. Also, I'd like to acknowledge our very supportive sponsors, National Archives of Australia, Echo Books, the History Guild, Big Sky Publishing, the Robert Menzies Institute, and I should add this Waverley RSL for assisting us because they've been very good to us over quite a long time now. Therefore, to you, the delegates and audience as such, thank you for attending. I trust you enjoy the conference, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. Now, may I introduce our officially imported conference chairman, Professor Craig Stockings. I won't read everything, you can do all that, but what I do want to state is Craig is a Professor of History and Head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Canberra campus, and that also includes our Australian Defence Force Academy. He is currently official historian of Australian operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and Australian peacekeeping operations in East Timor. He's published a large number of books, and you can amuse yourself by reading those in the annex to these particular program. And as you would now expect, he's our conference chairman. So to commence proceedings, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Craig Stockings to the lectern. You can put that up now. Yeah.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that introduction, General. Pardon me. That was much appreciated. I'm blushing underneath. Well, it is my absolute pleasure, I've got to say, and I say it in the most genuine terms I can, to be here with you, welcome you to the 5th Biennial Military History and Heritage Victoria Conference, as is noted. conference today being enticingly entitled Game of Dominoes, Australian Security in the Cold War from 1947 to 91. My thanks to you all for being here. Thanks also, of course, to the range of eminent scholars and practitioners and commentators we've assembled to talk to you today and tomorrow, for that matter. It's an honour to share the same space with thinkers of this calibre, and I, like the audience, like all of you, am excited to hear what they've got to say in the sections that follow. For my part, let me suggest this conference is both timely and it's important. It's not only a conference about what has been, but also something of a reflection of what might yet come. To this end, let me recoin a phrase that's been bandied about in recent months, and that is, in my view, the holiday from history is over. I note that as a historian, our past generations' understanding of great power politics and competition, and heaven forfend the potential for large-scale war on a Cold War scale, has been skewed. We've grown to adulthood in the shade of a post-Cold War unipolar world. We as a nation have benefited enormously in terms of security and economy, possibly or perhaps arguably in cultural terms as well, from this blip on the long span of modern history, but it is a blip. The challenges in front of us today are a return to more established patterns of life, a return to friction and struggles between great powers emerging and those seeking to maintain the status quo. It does and will inevitably involve competition, what has been labelled as grey zone operations, and though by no means inevitable, it involves a real possibility of conflict. It's well then we learn from the recent past. For its part, our nation is a small to medium power and faces no choice but to readapt to this re-emergent reality. We face security challenges not seen for decades and have to grapple with how to handle old problems in a new context. And make no doubt we've chosen sides. We've made a choice. The colours are nailed to the mast. There is no more public expression of this decision than AUKUS. There's no clearer statement of intent than those nuclear submarines. Adding another level of complication, if such rapidly changing strategic circumstances were not complex enough, it is that this critical sandpit, the potential battlefield here, the heart of this competition will unfold in the Indo-Pacific region, not in Europe. Now, much changes in world affairs and with the progression of time, but geography never alters. This is our region and our home. World attention will not focus on the Fulda Gap in the decades that will come. It will be focused on the maritime environment to our north. On top of all of this is an exponential growth in technology and technically related military developments, which includes, of course, but not limited to, all the buzzwords: hypersonics and artificial intelligence, remote systems, quantum technologies, and swarm heuristics, and I had to look that one up. The list goes on. It is not technological development in and of itself which is significant here, for that's always been the case in military affairs. At various times, the telegraph, combustion engine, the aircraft, radio communications have all been heralded as game changers. Yet the game's never changed. War still remains a contest between people and between human will. The tools always change, but the art and inherent characteristics of conflict stay the same. In the words of the famous Prussian, war changes its grammar, never its logic. Perhaps what's different then, in my mind at least, is not the fact of technological change, but its exponential rate of development. It's not enough now to think of how the next conflict might be fought in abstract, without thinking about the technologies that might frame that conflict. At the same time, as the recent ongoing hostilities in Ukraine have acted as a timely reminder for us, at least some of the ingrained patterns laid down during the Cold War are still relevant. Terms like attrition, mobilisation, conscription, casualty rates are not yet consigned to the dustbin of history. Which, my friends, brings us back to why we're here today to discuss Australia's security and the Cold War. My thanks to you all. It's time that I stop talking and give you a chance to listen to those you really wanted to come and hear today. And it's my particular honour to introduce our first keynote speaker, or the keynote speaker this morning. An individual to everyone in this room I'm sure I don't actually need to give an introduction for, because Professor Peter Edwards' eminence is known to us all. Not only a fellow official historian, but a giant in the field of political and security-related history. Certainly somebody that I've looked up for inspiration and for mentorship as well. With any further ado, please let me introduce Professor Edwards to you.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you all for coming here. It's great to see so many distinguished participants, and I congratulate Andrew Kilsby and David Green on bringing together such a distinguished group. Let me tell you, it's somewhat challenging to be asked to give the introduction to such an excellent group of speakers and participants. And to try and cover such a lot of ground with such a diverse program. The topics that before you stretch from military operations to matters of strategy, intelligence, international and domestic politics, and far beyond. So this is, as I say, a challenge. What I'll try to do here, and bearing in mind Jim Barry's comments about relevance and timely, and Craig Stockings about timeliness, what I'll try to do is to offer an overall perspective which I hope will put all these various topics, and indeed others that we may not be discussing in Australia's Cold War, into a wider frame. I hope this will help us to see the shape, or at least one way of shaping, the forest, while enabling us also to see how the important trees fit into that forest. And I'll do so in the spirit of learning from history, a topic of constant interest, on which David Lowe and colleagues have recently added another important book. We all have our favourite phrases about learning or failing to learn from history. My own favourite is that history is a constant debate between the present and the past about the future. And like Craig, I'll be saying a little bit about the future at the end. As Mark Twain famously observed, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And if we look at Australia's history of engagement with the world for the past 100 years and more, we can, I think, see a pattern in the way in which the country has sought to learn from the past while preparing for the future. After a period of major military engagement, the country celebrates what victories and achievements it can, mourns its losses, but tries to learn from both sides while assessing the present to devise a strategy for the foreseeable future. Usually the process takes about a decade of often intense discussion, vigorous debate, before a strategic framework is devised, after which the country, not just the government, but the country as a whole, seeks to implement that strategy, amending it, of course, as events dictate. The first time we can see this pattern, I think, is after the Great War of 1914-18, when, despite the tensions that sometimes arose between British and Australian military and political leaders, Australia, and here I'll use a totally anachronistic American expression, doubled down on the British Empire. This was you'll all know about the Singapore strategy, but it went far beyond that. The imperial preference in trade, reliance on British capital for finance, reliance on British sources for news, the reluctance, in contrast to certain other dominions, to create a foreign office and diplomatic service until very late in the 30s. And it was true of Australian institutions in general. The judges were taught that they had to observe British precedents in all courts, not just what the Privy Council said. It was as if by reasserting Australian dedication to King and Empire, Australia could somehow strengthen the empire itself, as well as thereby promoting Australia's national interests. There might even be a lesson for that, a lesson in that for today. But basically it seemed to all come undone in the Second World War, demonstrated spectacularly by the fall of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942. It seemed that total reliance on the imperial connection was over, but the habits and memories of that period lasted long afterwards. But what we see essentially after 1945 and through the whole Cold War period is a country coming to terms with its new status as a largely autonomous post-imperial participant in world affairs, accepting a greater degree of responsibility for its relations with the rest of the world in peace and war and what we now call the grey area in between. So the nation had to grapple with the requirements of not just developing a defence strategy, but something that could be called a national strategy, so that it wouldn't simply react in an ad hoc manner to events, but have some sort of strategic framework within which to make specific decisions. Now, Australians are very uncomfortable if anyone talks about a grand strategy or a national strategy. That seems far too pretentious for a small to medium country. So maybe I'd better borrow a phrase I think that came from Hillary Clinton a few years ago, strategic concepts. And during the period that we'll be looking at today, there was two strategic concepts that Australia developed between the late 1940s and the early 1990s. The first was forward defence for the third quarter of the 20th century, and the second, from the late 70s to the early 90s, the so-called self-reliant defence of Australia, sometimes adding within an alliance context. So Australia was on, and here I resort to another cliche, a learning curve. And that required looking, of course, at the balance between commitments and resources. As Arthur Tang liked to say, if you haven't talked dollars, you haven't talked strategy. We had to look at what we could do for ourselves and what required working with allies and other partners. It required looking at how much attention and resources to give to the continent and its immediate environment, how much attention and resources to give to the region, however we define the region, and the definition of the region has varied: the Pacific area, the Eastern Hemisphere, Asia, the Asia-Pacific, today the Indo-Pacific, and how much to cooperate with our traditional allies who had the power but were out of the area and perhaps had declining interest in the region. And even getting the right balance between those two powers was a challenge in itself. Now, at any given time, we know that there are likely to be advocates for a continental or a regional or a global approach to our involvement in the world. Governments have to achieve what they think is the right balance between them, and how to manage particularly both the regional and the alliance relationships, so that they can claim, certainly with more or less validity, that they are complementary rather than contradictory. Now, at the time and historically, we often tend to concentrate on the decisions made by prime ministers and perhaps a few close advisors. But this whole process requires the country to create and to shape and to develop the institutions that can create some sort of national strategy, and to establish the principles, the operational principles with which it operates, seeking to ensure that what emerges is a whole of government, preferably even whole of nation approach, with each major institution understanding its role, cooperating as appropriate, and trying to ensure that, as far as possible, the strategy has the informed support of the general public. So this means not just looking at the weapons systems and weapons platforms, which is where debate often concentrates, but looking at the whole structure, Parliament and relevant parliamentary committees, Cabinet and the committees that particularly deal with national security, the Defence Organisation and the Armed Services, the Foreign Office and Diplomatic Service, the intelligence agencies, the economic departments responsible for finance, commerce, trade, and, as relevant, the relevant areas of the private sector. Today, of course, defence industries. Now, none of this is easy. And I think we need to remember, it's easy to forget now, that Australia really started on this process in the post-1945 era from a very low base of individual experience in world affairs, as well as institutional development in strategic policy making. And the memories of that earlier period lingered long after they were perhaps relevant. Now, as I say, much of the discussion and debate around strategic matters tends to focus overwhelmingly on the weapons and the weapons platforms. And of course, governments have to be prepared for external threats, whether foreseen or unforeseen. But to the greatest extent possible, the capabilities and the operational doctrines of the armed services, as well as those given to the diplomatic service, to intelligence agencies, aid agencies, economic departments, and all the rest, should be determined by the overall strategy, not the other way around. So I'll come to forward defence, the first, I think, strategic concept that was evolved. After the fall of Saigon in April 1975, forward defence was stigmatised. There are still a few people who will glibly assert that it was little more than a combination of Australia's traditional phobias, the red peril and the yellow peril. I think it deserves a little more credit than that. Certainly not 3 cheers, but 1.5 to 2 cheers. And as I say, most of the impetus for the development of it took a decade after the end of the Second World War. Let's just look at some of the institutional development in the decade between the mid to late 40s and the mid to late 50s. Australia's whole way of conducting land warfare, particularly infantry, changed from the mass citizens' armies of the 2 world wars to the creation of a small professional standing army, the creation of the Royal Australian Regiment in 1948. And I think a lot of people still don't understand what a fundamental change that made. And that was augmented by raising the first company of the SAS in 1957. During that time, we also saw the creation of ASIO, ACES, and the forerunner of what is now the Signals Directorate, all of which encountered considerable difficulties and problems in their early relations with each other, with other government agencies, and not least in ASIO's case, with the wider public. The External Affairs Department, as Foreign Affairs was then known, was essentially a group of young and talented men, overwhelmingly male, but it was only knocked into shape as to become a reasonably effective and significant factor in policy making by the late 50s and early 60s. Official advice at the higher level was coordinated by a defence committee of senior civilian and uniformed officials. But rather slower to develop was the process and structures for ministerial decision making. It started off in the 1950s with Menzies gathering the ministers for defence and foreign affairs, or external affairs, foreign affairs, and the heads of their respective departments. But since Casey was often overseas, the defence minister was often on his outback property in outback South Australia, and the Secretary of Defence was in Melbourne, where the others, it was a pretty small group that often gathered to make crucial decisions. It wasn't until 1963 that Cabinet formed what was called the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee, the precursor to our National Security Committee. But at least it can be said that ministers and prime ministers made reasonably frequent and detailed statements to Parliament, so that the public had a reasonable idea of the direction in which the government was heading. So that's some of the institutional background, and institutions matter, both and the rivalries and of bureaucracies, both within institutions and between them, matter a great deal, as I'm sure we'll be hearing over the next 2 days. So that's the background within which the governments of the late 40s and especially the early 50s, the early years of Menzies' peacetime government, sought to assess the competing demands of the region and of relations with what Menzies called our great and powerful friends. Was, for example, Southeast Asia, often described at the time as a cauldron? Were those conflicts driven by external communism, or by the legitimate and understandable nationalist drive for decolonisation of the European empires? Or the third factor that was too often overlooked, the long-standing tensions and hostilities which had previously existed within that region? And accordingly, how should Australia respond to a request for assistance from great and powerful friends, either in the region or in global affairs, recognising that Australian security in this new area seemed to depend heavily, as it had before 1945, on the power and influence of those great powers, but fearing that those great powers had less interest in our immediate region than we did. What I think is remarkable, given the experience of the recent war and the complexities of this post-war situation, was the considerable degree of caution with which the government assessed likely threats and responded to pressures at times from Britain and the US to intervene militarily. A fundamental decision in the early 1950s was that Australia would direct its military forces only towards a role in Southeast Asia. It would not return to the Middle East, despite considerable pressure to do so from British political and military leaders, I think, and backed by the Americans. Even in Southeast Asia, Australia decided that it would accept military commitments only under certain conditions. It would not act alone, it would only act alongside forces from Britain, the US, or preferably both. Australia would only intervene when requested by what it considered to be the legitimate authority. Australia supported regime defence. It would not undertake invasions to institute regime change. While acting as far as possible with Britain, the US and New Zealand, to avoid the impression that 4 white countries were seeking to tell Asia how to conduct its affairs, Australia always sought to have the sanction of a multinational and, to be blunt, multiracial institution. Korea was fought under the banner of the United Nations. Malayan emergency and confrontation under the Commonwealth. And then, of course, came CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation, in which rather too much faith was put. And even when those conditions were met, the military commitment that Australia made was often limited to rather less and conceded rather more slowly and frankly and grudgingly than the relevant great power had sought. We gained a reputation in London and Washington for talking a good war. Now, through the 1950s and into the 60s, this seemed to work quite well. Korea came to be a sort of a template for how we wanted to conduct wars. The Americans provided the leadership and the real power, but we worked more closely with Britain and other Commonwealth countries with whom we were much more comfortable. And that seemed to work well in both Malaya and confrontation. Then came Vietnam, and it's sometimes forgotten that the initial commitment to Vietnam was shaped largely by concerns over Indonesia more than Vietnam itself. The need to support the US in whether it would turn out to be Vietnam or Thailand in order to win at least diplomatic and potentially military support over confrontation. The major decisions in late 64-65, including the introduction of conscription, were at least as much about the feared escalation of confrontation as they were with a view to South Vietnam or Thailand. I think the Menzies seemed to think that the commitment to Vietnam would be as successful and as straightforward as that in Malaya, and politically as successful, but the eventual outcome, I think, was shaped by his open-ended and ill-explained commitment, which owed much to his personal dominance of his cabinet and his party at the time, the deliberate exclusion of advice from foreign affairs, and indeed from sections of defence, the relative lack of independent military and diplomatic advice and intelligence, the failure to realise that Australia knew much less about mainland Southeast Asia than it did about maritime Southeast Asia, and the failure to realise that the United States itself knew much less about mainland Southeast Asia than about other parts of the world. But even focusing on Southeast Asia as the only region for military involvement did not mean rejecting other forms of cooperation with Britain and the US in the wider Cold War, and we see this in the way Australia offered its geography as an asset for cooperation. And we'll be hearing about Woomera and the atomic tests, the way we offered territory to Britain. These offers were not just designed to support the West in general in the Cold War. It was also a matter of trying to support or reinstitute Britain's place at what was called the top table of nuclear powers. To be blunt, Australia wanted to have two independently strong great power allies in the New World Order, not have to rely on just one. Australia knew that the power came from the United States, but many, not only Menzies, but many around in the political and military leadership thought that Britain had the greater experience and wisdom. It was only as the hope of British power faded that Australia turned to offering its real estate to the Americans for the joint facilities, Northwest Cape, Pine Gap and Urunga. So the lesson of all this period is that successful strategy depends not just on the deployment and the creation and deployment of military assets, but no less on the statecraft with which all the national assets, military, diplomatic, intelligence, geographic, financial, are deployed. It's only at the very end of this process that the capabilities and doctrines of the armed services should be created, should be evolved. Let me just quote one tiny, trivial example, which is a microcosm, but it happens to stick in my mind. My colleague and friend Ian McNeill was a Duntroon cadet in the early 1950s. And he told me, and as far as I know it's perfectly true, that the officer cadets of that era spent as much time you might say as much or as little time, preparing for Arctic warfare, learning how to handle a 303 Lee Enfield rifle while on skis. I can see it's a challenge. As much time on that as they did on preparing for jungle warfare. And then somebody worked out that the relative risk of Australians being involved in the jungles of Southeast Asia was somewhat greater than a commitment to northern Norway or Siberia. And so the doctrines changed, the Canungra Jungle Training Centre was reopened, and Australia worked well with British tactical doctrine in Malaya and elsewhere. So the fall of Saigon was seen as demonstrating the failure of not just the strategic and operational decisions that had been made in Vietnam, but the whole forward defence structure. So there was what was billed certainly as a wholesale reorganisation. And it may well be, I think, that some strategic babies were thrown out with the strategic bathwater. Once again, we saw a decade from the mid-70s to the mid-1980s of a great deal of public about where do we go from here as a nation, not only in defence but as a wider considerations. There was a major decade of reform of strategic policy at the top, replacing forward defence with the self-reliant defence of Australia and its approaches, and much talk about the air-sea gap to the north of Australia. At that time also the three armed services were integrated into the Australian Defence Force, and supposedly much greater emphasis on joint operations with the services fighting to supporting each other in combat, rather than each working with the sister services of allied nations. The process started with a statement of general principles in the first Defence White Paper, 1976. And as things were thrashed out, it was only the capabilities only came at the end of a long debate, with the DIB report on capabilities in 1986, and then the whole lot supposedly being brought together in the Beazley White Paper of 1987. While that was all going on in that same decade, there were three major inquiries, two of which had the status of Royal Commissions, which led to major reform of the intelligence agencies, the aim to create them into an Australian intelligence community with a new central agency, but very different from the CIA of Langley, Virginia, based on analysis only. It restructured the agencies, gave them new legislation and operational direction. It gave them new direction in their relations with the US and other intelligence partners. And all this done in a climate where there are many on the left who thought that the CIA had been nefariously involved in the dismissal of the Whitlam government. And also at the same time, the media, especially print media, was going through some vigorous reform and giving prominence to challenges from across the political spectrum to official statements and official policy decisions. So in that context, the government had to put considerable diplomatic and political effort into gaining popular acceptance that Pine Gap and the other joint facilities were justified in the wake of Vietnam, even at the expense of making Australian territory a potential target in a nuclear or major conventional conflict. And all this was seen, it was thrashed out, but it was seen as giving our diplomacy, led by first Bill Hayden and then Gareth Evans, as giving them more freedom of manoeuvre to operate, especially within the region, without what they had previously regarded as the unduly heavy hand of Washington. Now, all this remains controversial, but perhaps fortunately, as Craig has just alluded to, what followed was what has sometimes been called the Long Peace. It was a relatively benign period. And the first major involvement was Timor in 1999, after the Cold War had ended. And one reflection on this whole period is when one looks again, going back to confrontation and then reading Craig Stockings' excellent and fascinating volume on the Timor commitment. How was it that we got from seeing good relations with Indonesia, the Indonesian government of the day, as the radical alternative in the 1960s, to become the dominant paradigm in the early 1990s, which had to be overturned with great difficulty in 1999. But the wider lessons that I want to draw now are that the best strategic decisions come from wide and testing debate involving both sides of Parliament, involving the public and the media, naturally, as far as is possible, involving all the major institutions and not just the armed services, involving our diplomats, involving our economic departments, involving our intelligence agencies, the best when they are all working well and working within their respective briefs. Good decisions take into account all the major factors in strategic policy, getting that balance right between the continental, the regional and the global, between independence and alliance, between military and diplomatic and financial and geographic and other assets and weaknesses. The worst decisions, like Menzies' attempted intervention in Suez in 1956 or the commitment to Vietnam, frequently come from overconfident prime ministers acting with very limited advice from a small group with a strong ideological or other commitment. After the Cold War ended, it looked like we were going to go through a similar period, a decade of discussion. And we did, in fact, start a serious debate on future strategy, based on what is striking the right balance between the US alliance and a rising China, but at that time non-aggressive. It was still hiding its strength and biding its time. Then came 9/11 and we got distracted into the global war on terror. The commitment there, I think, flouted some of those principles that we should have learned. Prime ministers of the day did not seek advice on whether to get involved, but only on how to give support to the US and thus strengthen the alliance, without taking into consideration other effects on Australia's interest and long-term strategy. We became involved in invasions of both Iraq and Afghanistan in order to achieve regime change. And some of you may remember that there was a famous letter by, I think, 43 very senior and distinguished diplomatic and military leaders who objected, particularly over Iraq, saying Australia does not do this. It also meant involvement in a region where the direct effect on Australian national interests, as distinct from the alliance and the global order, was far less clear than it had been in earlier times in Southeast Asia. Now, this all came to a spectacular end on the 15th of August 2021. You'll all remember those scenes of the Kabul airport on that day. It seemed to be as searing an experience as the 15th of February 42 in Singapore or the 30th of April 75 in Saigon. And I thought that we would have another long period of debate. In fact, I was one of a group of people who was asked to contribute by a think tank to a little piece on where do we go from here? You know, what happens after Kabul? And I wrote a little piece along these lines saying that it happened to coincide with certain anniversaries, and some think tanks were already preparing reports on how we should handle the alliance and how we should handle strategy more generally. I completed my little piece and was about to send it off on the 17th of September, and then woke up on the morning of the 18th September to find that AUKUS was suddenly announced, quite unexpectedly, with no previous briefing. And we now know that that decision flouted many of what should have been the lessons that should have been learned. The decision was negotiated quite deliberately. I think Mr. Morrison has actually boasted that he kept his Foreign Affairs Minister and Department out of any such discussions. But it also didn't involve any discussion of the impact on the defence budget as a whole and other defence priorities, on the financial and workforce implications, the fact that we didn't have a nuclear industry, etc. All the matters which are now being raised ex post facto. It had been negotiated secretly by the Prime Minister and a small group of advisors, many of whom were clearly delighted by the prospect of acquiring what they regard as the apex predator of maritime force. Now, since then, we've had the Defence Strategic Review of 2023 and other official statements, which have often said many of the right things. We need a whole-of-government approach to strategy, even a whole-of-nation approach to strategy. It says statecraft is hugely important as well as military power. And there are many other worthy statements, but they tend to be one-line statements rather than discussions of how they're to be put into effect. And in general, there's a strong impression that the strategy is being retrospectively built around one military capability rather than the other way around. I suggest, and I'm sure I'll come under fire for this, but it seems to me that the capability cart has been put before the strategic horse. So perhaps one lesson of Australia's Cold War and the subsequent geopolitical events is that in the long run, it is wiser to have a robust, even if lengthy and at times divisive debate about Australia's role in world affairs, the likely threats that it's to face, and the appropriate strategic concepts, working out what we can do best, and where we are better to rely on alliances and partnerships before deciding on the weapons and weapons platforms with which we seek to carry out the military aspects of that national strategy. I leave you with that thought and look forward to the rest of this conference. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like not only to thank Peter for his presentation, but to give you the chance to ask some questions. I think. Thank you. Don't be shy.
Yeah, Peter, I really loved your statement. And you said history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I guess
Mark Twain.
yeah, but you can take the credit. I guess with the potentially the beating of the drums of war, potentially, you made a comment in relation to Mr. Morrison and the AUKUS announcement. And I wonder whether or not that decision may have been made with all of that going on in the background with what China's been doing as an element of defence's mantra, essentially, to deter, and respond. So it's about that deterrence at the moment. I'm interested in your comments on that.
I think a lot of there's a lot of sensible comment about, and I'm sure you're exactly right. That's what they did have in mind, and that's how it's been justified. But as others, including Peter Varghese, many others, have pointed out, deterrence can be done in a lot of different ways. And is this the best way to use Australian resources and Australian experience to deter China, or should we leave the nuclear powered submarines aspect of it to countries which have much greater experience, which have a nuclear industry, which have been doing this for a while, and concentrate on things that we do better ourselves? I mean, it seems to me that the so-called Pillar 2 of AUKUS makes a lot of sense. That may be partly because I don't understand what hypersonics and all those other things are. But we have good scientists. We have good people in universities doing things in that area. I believe the Defence Science and Technological Organisation has a pretty good reputation. We can build on that, develop that, and if other countries like Japan are brought into it, so much the better. But to leap into a totally different field where, I hope I don't create offence in this, but a strong tradition of submarine warfare is not part of Australia's military tradition. And we're suddenly leaping from, as it were, making Toyota Corollas into trying to build Bentleys and Rolls Royces. That does seem a bit of a leap, and other parts of defence, let alone other parts of the economy, are starting to wonder what we will do. The latest issue of Australian Foreign Affairs contains Hugh White's article on strategic arguments as to why AUKUS may never happen anyway, and why it probably shouldn't. But there's also an article by a very sober analyst, Andrew Davies. He said, let's just look at the economic implications, at the workforce implications. It's likely to be much more costly in all sorts of unexpected ways that we haven't thought through. So I think now there's a great effort into trying to get the whole nation behind it, and promising jobs and promising defence industry involvement. But it seems to me that should have been thought out beforehand and working out against alternative options.
Up the back.
Thank you. Before John Howard changed public service, permanent heads of department would stay there, governments would come and go, they were still the heads of department, and they fearlessly gave advice to governments whether they liked it or not. In the current environment, are heads of department still giving frank and fearless advice, or do they feel somewhat cowed by the fact that they could be tossed out?
That's certainly a factor. They will certainly say, as Peter Shergold said when he was Secretary of PMNC under John Howard, that they still give frank and fearless advice. The robo-debt affair does lead one to question that. And it's not just the heads of departments. The days of the Arthur Tangs and others, and Fred Wheelers, is undoubtedly over. I suspect we have swung rather too far the other way. And it's also the diminution of the role of the departments. They used to be just the sole advisors on many of those areas. And that is not entirely desirable. Advice should be contested and debated. But also the whole public service structure, as we saw in robo-debt and other matters, it goes far down the line, and people do what the minister wants or what the ministerial advisor tells them what the minister wants. And given certain recent events in the law courts, you wonder about the standards of the ministerial advisors and their ability to give sage and learned and experience-based advice on long-term policy decisions.
Final question, please. I think it was down front.
Hello, Peter. Peter, while it's understandable Morrison excluding foreign affairs from the AUKUS discussions, in fact he may even be the minister then, what's less comprehensible perhaps is Menzies' exclusion of foreign affairs from the decision-making going into Vietnam. Could you elaborate perhaps why that exclusion happened? There would be some personal dimension, I'd imagine, but there must have been other factors, because it seems quite remarkable, certainly more so than Morrison's decision-making process.
Thank you, Philip. It's a delight to see you here. It comes from the previous experience, I think, of particularly 1963, over confrontation. We sometimes forget now that if you looked at newspaper headlines in Australia through 1963, well into all of 64 and into the early 65, very little about Vietnam, very little suggestion. Very few people, said we're likely to get involved in Vietnam, or maybe we should, or should we or shouldn't we? An enormous focus on Indonesia and President Sukarno, and was he a threat, and was his apparent threat to West New Guinea a forerunner of further expansion. And the British were playing this up, of course, and they were actually making, in diplomatic statements, they were comparing Sukarno to Hitler, and expansionist. He had ambitions on Timor, and perhaps he would attack south, etc. And it was in that context when when I think it was Dean Rusk put out started the More Flags campaign. In other words, he was calling for allies to support the US in Vietnam at the same time as the British were calling for more support against Indonesia and trying to stay out of Vietnam. That put Australia in a great spot. At that time, until April '64, our foreign minister was Garfield Bowie. Now I'm going to say something which will offend people on the right wing of politics, and on the left wing of politics for different reasons. But I think Garfield Bowie was a better foreign minister than he was as an Attorney General or as Chief Justice of the High Court. It's because he was the person, he developed in close collaboration with the diplomats of the department the approach of saying we've got to get on with Indonesia, and just total confronting confrontation has to be handled carefully. And it was largely through him that we devised a very skillful way, which was put into effect very skillfully by diplomats, by the military operating in confrontation and elsewhere, of keeping channels open with Indonesia at the same time as saying, you can do this but no further. And that worked extremely well. If there had been an open debate, as some people are calling for, in Parliament on whether or not we should go to war, and if it had been a totally free debate, you would have had the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, Menzies and Cornwall, saying, let's go, you would have had the deputy leader of the opposition and effectively foreign affairs spokesman, Gough Whitlam, and the foreign minister, Garfield Barwick, who of course later would be very much at odds, saying, no, we handle this a bit more carefully and diplomatically and skillfully. And I think that is why Menzies thought, I'm tired of having these diplomats, telling me the soft option or telling me, what to do or what not to do. And the changeover of Minister from Barwick to Paul Hasluck made that a lot easier.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to thank Peter once more?